everyone, this is Dr. Harold, here to do the first lecture in our remote class for Arts and Cultures from Antiquity for NYU, for the Go Local program. So I compiled this short PowerPoint to be an introduction to our course. None of this material is really, it's never going to be tested. You won't need to know this stuff, but I thought it would be useful to have a foundation for why this course is important, why NYU Liberal Studies asks you to take it. And to do that, I think it is kind of crucial to have some sort of introductory knowledge about the ancient world. I'm spinning it through the theme of our class, this term form and formlessness. So hopefully we'll have some time to talk about that. But yeah, so here's just a brief introduction to the course itself, the sort of ideas we'll be talking about, art and culture in antiquity, and then leading into why the invention of writing is so important to that end. So just to begin, I wanted to talk about some of the places we'll be discussing this semester. We won't be talking about all of these geographical regions, but one thing to note is the places we will be discussing in terms of the art and culture of the ancient world, they stem from what anthropologists, archaeologists call cradles of civilization. Used to be, we would say, the cradle of civilization most of the time. People by that meant the Fertile Crescent region here, but this is a very Western-centric view of things. We now know that there were various regions in the world that became cradles for vast civilizations to crop up, and so that's what these sort of screenshots are all about. So clockwise from the top, we've got the North China Plain here. The Yellow River or whatever, the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So this is a sort of, this is the top of India here. So this sort of fertile region up here, this is where, the ancient Indian cultures began. The Mesoamerican Gulf Coast, we won't spend a ton of time with this region, but this was also a cradle of civilization. Some of the earliest Americans come from here. And then the Fertile Crescent, which usually gets taught a lot in sort of Western culture. So this it's called crescent because it looks like a crescent moon, sort of. So the region in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and then in Upper Egypt with the Nile Delta down here, and then through like where Israel currently is in Palestine. And then the Andean coast, this is the coast of South America here, where the sort of ancient Andes culture cropped up. So the thing to kind of keep in mind here, it's like obvious, kind of goes without saying, but these are all regions around which, around river systems that drain into larger bodies of water. So that will be the case for all of the cultures that we'll be thinking about, that like these were cultures that cropped up, civilizations that cropped up in regions where it was, a livable situation, where civilizations could be fostered. One other thing to kind of say is that the potential for new discoveries is always going to be possible, especially now with Google Earth and these sorts of technologies. People are discovering ancient sites. Like a lot of recent discoveries have happened. There are many mysteries still yet to be deciphered. We don't know everything, and we won't be able to know everything in this course, of course. So, for instance, there's apparently in this sort of Indus region, people have found a system of writing that no one knows yet how to decipher. So, like archaeologists might find these things, and we just don't know what to make of them. I also, just yesterday, read this news story that I'll post to our course site that kind of reconfigures how we think of the origin of civilizations. Usually people think that agriculture started first, and then when people were gathered to, because they could live, because they could sustain the civilization, then they turned to creating art and culture and that sort of thing. But apparently at a site in Turkey, they found, Turkey's like over in here, they found some evidence that religious rituals were predating agricultural sites. So that might kind of be an exciting thing for historians, for archaeologists, for people who are interested in these things. Okay, so that's enough of that. So these next few slides, just want to do a plug for our course. We'll be very interested in the history of art. And this is something that I'm less adept with myself. I'm been trained in the sort of literary textual side of things. And so art is something that I'm always interested in, but I feel a little bit uneasy interpreting myself, but it's a good thing to kind of get in the practice of. But I wanted to give you some examples of how disparate the artifacts, visually, the visual artifacts we have in terms of these early cultures. This one on the left here, people call it the Venus of Whole Fells or something. I don't know how to pronounce this, but this is look how old it is, 33,000 BC to 38,000. So very, very old, very, very old. It's in fact the oldest example we have found so far of what people can say definitively is a human form. And you might be like, that's human? Interesting. You could say it's a head, arms. It seems to be female. Note the exaggerated features of her body. We might kind of think, like, what is this about? Like, why were these ancient people creating this artifact? Is it religious? Is it sort of like aspirational? What is it? Over here on the right, this is, it's much younger, it's much newer of a creation, but it's also on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of size for art. This is an Olmec head, which it was unearthed in Mexico. Both of these were literally unearthed. They were buried, but they were quite different. The tiny Venus was only 6 centimeters in length. It seems to have been like a pendant, maybe jewelry or something. The Olmec head, however, is enormous. It's taller than the average person. It's 24 tons. It's huge. What might an ancient culture mean by creating something like this? Like, is it designed to intimidate? Is it designed to inspire awe in the viewer? Like, what is it? Anyway, these might be things to think about. You'll have the opportunity to do so on Brightspace. Here are a couple more. These are both cave paintings, so you might think about, like, why were ancient cultures, creating art in caves? There might be various answers to that. But both of these are very old examples of cave paintings here from South Sulawesi in Indonesia. With you can see sort of handprints here, perhaps other images, maybe. Hard to tell, really. Here in this cave painting in South Africa, it seems to be agricultural, perhaps, or maybe it's like a herd of wild animals or something. Anyway, what makes a person, a family, a culture turn to representing their world or their imaginations in art? Why do they do it? What do they mean by it? These are some of the questions we'll consider in this class. Okay. One other thing that we will be taking into account, especially in our early days together in this course, is this distinction between the art that cultures produce that is verbal. And this is a big distinction in sort of the history of archaeological discipline. So yeah, this is a big distinction that archaeologists will make, that anthropologists will make. A culture that is primarily oral or a culture that is primarily written will be something that people will want to distinguish between. And it's going to be a concern for our class as well. An oral culture. So this is just an artistic representation that refers to the existence of an oral culture. This is It's a cithode, a classical Greek professional performer, someone who would play a harp or a lyre to accompany themselves as they sing a song or a poem. We'll talk much more about this when we discuss Homer and Hesiod. But think about what an oral culture is. To define it, an oral culture is a culture that transmits its ideas, its values, its art orally. They don't write things down. So what does that mean? How can you transmit culture, stories, art orally only? You likely, how it works is you have to repeat it over and over and over again, right? Otherwise it'll be lost. Another kind of avenue for this means that if a story is important enough to be preserved, that means that it's often preserved communally as well. People, like, if you went to hear a cithode perform, you probably would be in a group of people where everyone is hearing the story together, experiencing it together, feeling together, perhaps. So it has this sort of, oral cultures tend to be very cohesive culturally. They tend to share a lot of the same values that they experience together through that performance. So transmitting the values of the culture is performative in some ways. It's also an act of remembrance in others. We'll talk about this with Homer, but an oral culture allows for innovations on a story that you already know, as you might connect themes from one story with another story that's similar or maybe different. This kind of culture requires a very accurate and also expansive and innovative form of memory. It will involve reverence, deep reverence for the past and previous generations, because those are the generations that retain the knowledge of those stories of the past. So deep respect for the past, for your ancestors, this sort of thing. And you might think today, like, we still have some aspects of today that are transmitted orally. You'll have time on Brightspace to think of examples from your own life, maybe your family or your culture, where there's something that you learned that was never really written down. It was something that you were just told and maybe repeated in your family or in your story of your life. And then we'll be thinking about that in relation to a written culture. And I'm acting like these are very disparate things. In fact, some of the things we'll be thinking about in this course is the fact that oral cultures and written cultures were existing concurrently and maybe influencing each other. Just because a written culture starts to become present doesn't mean the oral culture goes away, etc. Anyway, written cultures. This is an artistic representation of a scribe from ancient Egypt, the New Kingdom period. You can see him with a thing in his lap here. He's writing. This is some hieroglyphics here. So a written culture is a community that can begin to transmit some of its knowledge and values and art through writing it down, through actually inscribing via a written language. And of course, writing things down is great for us. Of course, it's if you no longer have to remember and constantly repeat something, if it's actually written down in like a physical object, then you can retain it more easily. You can capture it. Writing helps us preserve the past. It gives us greater insights about than we might otherwise have if these things had not been written down. But sometimes we can, especially from our modern viewpoint, sometimes we can valorize writing a little bit too much. Writing doesn't get everything, can't quite capture all the nuances of something. If you write your name down and give it to somebody, like I have a list of all of your names. I know what your name is. I could look up what it means. I could look up the character, and kind of deduce, your surname, your first name, and perhaps how meaningful that might be potentially, but that doesn't really capture who you are, of course. And the same sort of thing kind of goes for these written languages too. Just because something's written down doesn't mean we have a one-to-one relationship with the reality of that time in which it was written. Many things might have happened here. And that's sort of getting at the theme of this course, form and formlessness. We'll be looking at a lot of very ancient art forms, but do those forms really capture everything, that we could possibly know about the past? No, they can't. They cannot. So let's see here. Doopy-doopy-doo. Okay, so yeah, we'll be kind of thinking more about that. And to more of that end, we will... These next slides are organized into sort of the sections of the course. We will be beginning our course in this sort of ancient Middle Eastern region with the sort of ancient Babylonian Empire here. We start here because this, at least right now, tends to be the earliest example of written languages. Here, it seems like writing might have been invented here. Whatever. It was invented various places, but at least the earliest form of writing that we know of so far was present here. And so, again, note that this is sort of like a rich agricultural region, the Nile Delta, very fertile, the Fertile Crescent between these two rivers, very nice, we'll talk about Troy later. Anyway. Okay. So we'll be starting here. This is the earliest example of a written language that we have. It's not even that old. Compare this to the Venus of Fels that was, 10 times as old as this. But the earliest form of writing, the earliest alphabet that we know about, is called cuneiform. Here's an early version of it here on the left. Its earliest version included, or it mainly, the earliest version was pictographic, meaning people just drew pictures, and the pictures related to something that existed in reality. Eventually, the pictures, they could get more and more whatever. Whatever. Eventually, the pictures, it's hard to draw a picture. It's like, imagine having to draw an emoji over and over again. That would be crazy. Eventually, the writing would sort of evolve into the later form of cuneiform here, which is a system of wedges. So this would be like you'd have a piece of clay that's wet. You'd have a little stick with a kind of indentation on it. And with that stick, the stylus, you would push into the clay in order to render the alphabet here. And it becomes less, decipherable. So for here, this seems to be like a tree. This seems to be some sort of rake or something. I don't know. People think, archaeologists believe that this image here likely refers to a slaveholder, someone who controlled with their hand the labor of someone else. So they think that, in fact, a lot of the earliest examples of written languages refer to agricultural things that they needed to write down. Stuff like, how many slaves you had, how many livestock, how many crops you plan to grow, that sort of thing. It wasn't like literature in the earliest examples of written language. Okie dokie. So yeah, cuneiform is an interesting alphabet. We'll learn more about it when we talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you care about this, the writing is each character apparently symbolized a syllable, and the alphabet it existed of consonants only, so no vowels. It was adapted to be the alphabet for Semitic Akkadian, which actually a lot of different languages, Hurrian, Hittite, Luwian. There's various languages that we don't really have around so much anymore, but these very early languages in the sort of Mesopotamian region. Okay, it would eventually be replaced by Phoenician. But before we get to Phoenician, let's talk about this. This is a really important discovery of ancient cuneiform text. We will be reading what was written on some of these tablets with the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is in the, you can actually go to this exhibit in the British Museum now. The British tend to like to go into a place that's not Britain and discover things and then take it back to Britain. Ha ha ha. So anyway, the first library to contain all knowledge. Note that they these are clay tablets. They probably in the original library of this Mesopotamian king Ashurbanipal, they probably weren't presented this way, but you know, the museum curators organized it like a library sort of. Anyway, okay, so this library of this very learned Babylonian king Ashurbanipal was discovered by this British man, Austin Henry Layard, and his Middle Eastern assistant, who likely very much helped him, Hormuzd Rassam. They discovered the library in 1849. What Layard was looking for was, he was hoping to find definitive proof that the Hebrew Bible was the earliest work of literature ever. That's what he wanted to find, but actually he found evidence that contradicted that. He found the Library of Ashurbanipal, which predated the Hebrew Bible. This was a wonderful find because he discovered the sort of like most of, if not all, of the Epic of Gilgamesh here. This is the earliest ancient text that we have, that we know about. We'll be reading a version of this. Until he found this, it seemed as if that epic had been lost. It wasn't copied into a new language, for example, and preserved over the centuries. It all seemed to have vanished, but actually it hadn't vanished. It was just buried in these clay tablets. Okay. Things to note here. This is again more examples of cuneiform. Cuneiform was used by a series of empires in the region that ruled in the Fertile Crescent: the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Assyrians. So they all used this language system, cuneiform. It was used until the Persian Empire of Cyrus captured Babylon in 539 BC. And then the region became under the rule of Alexander the Great, the Greek. And so by that point, cuneiform was no longer used. Let's see here. This image here is part of a stele, S-T-E-L-E, so stele of vultures. It's broken. It would have been much taller. A stele is a thing that it sort of like commemorates a military victory in a very like violent but like awesome sort of way. So this depicts 5 vultures feeding on severed human heads with 4 registers of cuneiform script below. So this thing would be quite large and awe-inspiring. It would probably be intimidating, particularly with the vultures eating human heads and all that. And this is just I'm including it because, you know, language, literature can kind of be seen as, you know, soft, I guess, or arty, these sort of things. But often these ancient literatures are the tools of an empire. They're the means by which an empire can rule. Yeah, so that's going to be something we'll think about a lot over the semester too. That the sort of very close connection between violent, expansive empire and literary language. Okay, so like I was saying before, cuneiform is the language that captured the first or the earliest great epic of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here's an ancient Assyrian statue. People think it might have been Gilgamesh just because he's so enormous. You'll read more about Gilgamesh soon. Here on the right is tablet 11. Each of the tablets is like a chapter in the epic. Tablet 11 is the very, very famous one. It's called the Deluge tablet. Deluge means the flood. We'll talk much more about this with the Epic of Gilgamesh, but this was sort of definitive proof that the Hebrew Bible was not the oldest early literature. It was not the first flood story with Noah and the flood. In fact, there was Gilgamesh with the flood before. Okay, so thinking about cuneiform, this language that had been lost and buried, and finally was discovered in the 19th century by the British Empire. If we contrast that with ancient Egyptian, it's actually pretty exciting in my mind. Yeah. Ancient Egyptian was never really lost in the way that cuneiform was, because we could always see the pyramids, these huge examples of the ancient Egyptian world that remained, very, very present in Egypt. You probably have seen some hieroglyphics in your life, but here's some on the right here, mature hieroglyphics. So this is, as the system of writing became perfected, it started to look like this. The earliest versions are over here on the left. Also pictogram, of course, so like, this is a human figure, likely it has something to do with humans. Egyptian hieroglyphs, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so yeah, where cuneiform was buried, ancient Egyptian was very present, but we just didn't know what it meant. That is until this discovery, the Rosetta Stone. So consider how weird that would be. You would go into like an ancient Egyptian sort of pyramid, see the hieroglyphics on the wall, know it meant something. Clearly, it's so many pictures, it can't just be like, a whole wash of emojis. It must mean, something. But you couldn't understand what it meant. In 1799, the French, what would you call it? What is Napoleon? He's an emperor, I guess. Emperor Napoleon, yeah. Yeah, so the French soldiers of Napoleon stumbled upon this discovery here, the Rosetta Stone. So again, another instance whereby an empire makes an important discovery about art and culture. Napoleon in this case, and the French. I think the Rosetta Stone is in Britain now too. It's in the British Library. They always tend to get these things. So you might know about this already, but if you don't, I'll kind of walk you through the Rosetta Stone, why this was so important. So this is a sort of an imagination of what the Rosetta Stone likely looked like. It was probably also sort of a stele, this sort of kind of like triumphant, kind of victorious, massive thing. Excuse me. Here's what was great about the Rosetta Stone. It has 3 different portions of it. The top was ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The middle was, this is also Egyptian, but it's called demotic, which is it's a term that just refers to the sort of more everyday Egyptian, not as fancy, not as formal. And then at the bottom, the great thing about it was Greek. It included Greek on the bottom. So each of the portions has the same content, the same sort of meaning, but rendered in 3 different languages. And especially because Greek was included, this gave people the tools to translate hieroglyphics. So it was this wonderful discovery. Now, with the help of the Rosetta Stone, they could go back to the sort of Egyptian hieroglyphics on the walls and be able to read it. Just so you know, I thought this was interesting. This circle here with the thing at a right angle to the circle, that indicates apparently a proper name, and this is the way that the name Ptolemy, that is Ptolemy, Ptolemy, the classical scientific thinker of ancient Greece, is mentioned here. So that's kind of interesting. This like Greek scholar is mentioned in ancient Egyptian and everything. Okay, so that's ancient Egyptian. We'll be reading some Egyptian poems this semester. After those 2, cuneiform and Egyptian, it's important to talk about ancient Phoenician, because Phoenician script was the means by which the Hebrew Bible basically was transmitted. Phoenician's an interesting alphabet. So the Phoenician alphabet existed. It was invented by the Phoenicians, but funnily enough, there's not really a Phoenician piece of art or culture that survives. The Phoenician alphabet was just really useful to various cultures. So different Semitic people adapted this alphabet to their languages. So and then the most famous group of people to do that were the Hebrews. So the Hebrews used Phoenician to record their religious texts. Phoenician consists of consonants only, and so that's why Hebrew also only uses consonants. You have to know Hebrew, and you have to know it well enough so that you can assume the vowel sounds that are needed in the language. So this also means that there's room for different interpretations because not all of the sounds are included. So there's some biblical scholars who disagree about various meanings and in the Hebrew Bible and all that. What's also cool about Phoenician and its use is that this is the first language that we've talked about so far that didn't exist because of an empire. The Hebrews were never really rulers in the same way that Babylonian kings or Egyptians were. They were there's different stories, but they were, for the most part, a minority population just trying to survive much stronger imperial forces that were threatening to drive them out of their homeland, their cultures. So the Babylonians did it, the Greeks did it, the Romans later did it. Right. Yeah. But that's not to say, of course, that doesn't discount how important this system of language and culture is. Hebrew Judaism is obviously the foundation of both Christianity and also Islam. So, even here, this language system becomes kind of like foundational for stuff. So, okay. Sorry, Hebrew. Okay, and this is kind of one thing to kind of keep in mind too. This is sort of a translation of empire kind of argument as well. As Greek became, Greek used the Phoenician alphabet. So let me show you. You can kind of tell a little bit some of these. They sort of adapted it for their own purposes, I guess. But, Greek existed as a language that was verbal. Once they kind of traded with the Phoenicians, they were like, hey, this alphabet's great, let's use it. So they used the consonants for sounds in Greek, and then the Phoenician sounds that they didn't have in Greek, they just used those for vowels. So the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet, but used its characters to include vowel sounds. So that was actually really revolutionary. It seems very minor, but it was revolutionary because, unlike Hebrew, where you had to kind of know the language and then assume the vowels, Greek, you could, if you knew how the sounds were made, you could read everything. You wouldn't have to make assumptions at all. And so that was actually the first real transmittable alphabet in the ancient world. So you still had to be literate, you had to be able to read it, but you didn't have to have special training to decipher the gaps in the words left by omitting the vowels. And so Greek is the first language that was really used throughout the Mediterranean along all the coasts because it was just useful, very adaptable language. This is the language of the great epics of the Iliad, the Odyssey, Hesiod's epics as well. It was written down, those were written down in the 6th to 8th centuries BC by Homer. And then, of course, Greek is sort of the foundation in a lot of ways for Latin, which would become the imperial language of Rome. And so, of course, that became even more transmittable. And just to kind of say that how important these are is it's Greek and Latin words by which we know the ancient world. If you think back to the Venus of Fels, we call her Venus. That's the name of the Latin goddess of love, even though that was, 30,000 BC and Latin, existed much, much later. We still kind of interpret the ancient world through the lens in a lot of ways of the ancient Greek language, the ancient Latin language as well. So these things kind of become very important. Okie dokie. Okay, so about face. We're going to turn from sort of the history of the ancient Western world to the East and thinking about poetry and thought in ancient China. So Excuse me. What's great about ancient China is they always, from its origins, poetry was held up as kind of integral towards the foundation of the state and political ideas. In fact, so this emperor, the first emperor of the Wei dynasty, Cao Pai, this is translated, of course, literary works offer, quote, the greatest legacy in governing the kingdom. So literature was very respected throughout the sort of ancient world in China. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but Chinese, Hansa, as a written language, it has elements of the pictographic, kind of like hieroglyphics. Also has this, linguists will call this ideogram, which is like the meaning of the word might be rendered in the physical manifestation of the character. So like Shang and Xia are good examples of that, like up and down. Also, some of the characters have a combination of the sound and a radical. So like, anyway, where for, kind of meaning day or whatever, or sun, kind of looks like a sun, and eventually it kind of became, here. The earliest form of ancient Hansa was written in sort of ritualistic religious capacities. So here you see this ox scapula with an oracle inscription from the Shang dynasty. Here, various early dynasties in China, very ancient ones that might have not existed, like perhaps they did. So like the Xia dynasty, considered semi-mythical potentially. The Shang dynasty, the first writing developed then, that's when the ox scapula is from. And then the dynasties that we'll be considering in class together are the writings of the Zhou dynasty primarily. And that includes the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou, including these periods that you might have studied in your schooling up till now. But yeah, these will be the majority of our focus will be here. The classic of poetry that was perfected kind of during this period. And then later, imperial dynasties, the Qin dynasty and the Han dynasty. I'm not sure, I don't think we'll be reading much from those. But cool, well, one great thing about Chinese, ancient Chinese writing is how sort of reified it was. There are the three classics of Chinese literature written during the Western Zhou era: the Book of Documents, the Book of Changes, the Book of Odes. Our focus will, of course, be on the Book of Odes, the art and culture side of things. All of these have a lot of grounding in Confucian ideas about, social life and statecraft and that sort of thing. China, even though it covered this vast territory, it has this sort of centralizing force through its literatures, and some of that is just like cultural, I guess, but in some ways it was the result of some very violent tendencies towards burning books and killing people who disagreed with the sort of centralizing viewpoint that certain emperors wanted to further. So yeah. So anyway, we'll kind of be talking about this a little bit. There's different empires that tended to be good at organizing a bunch of disparate people. The ancient China tended to enforce and encourage cohesion, and sort of cultural unity. And it's it kind of works, I guess. Okay. Let's see. Anything else? Book of Changes. It's a language of yeah. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, we'll kind of be talking about that, how the Book of Odes is kind of central to the sort of coherence and also the spread of Chinese culture through these sort of classics of literature. Okay. Okay, and then we'll be talking about ancient India as well. So India is an interesting place. It also is good, an interesting corollary to China, I believe, because it has many more sort of like amorphousness things going on. Very different cultures, kind of like all sort of maintained in this one, kind of nation, I guess. So yeah, India has maintained connections to its ancient roots despite centuries of change and great diversity. Over 20 different languages spoken, many, many, many more dialects that are local. Here are some of the ancient writings of India's heroic age. We won't be reading all of these, but just so you know, the Vedas, these are the sort of originary religious documents of Hinduism, and then later it would become Buddhism too. The Upanishads, the Ramayana. We'll be reading a truncated version of the Ramayana together, the first epic of India. The Mahabharata is the second epic. The Mahabharata includes the Bhagavad Gita, which you might have heard about. In our class, we won't be reading those. Peppered throughout this time, in terms of time period, also stories from the Jataka, which would be adapted towards Buddhism later. And then we'll read some of the Tamil anthologies to give you kind of a sense of the range of different writings that were going on in India. The Tamil anthologies come from South India, whereas the majority of these other documents kind of come from the northern region, where the sort of religious the origin of Hinduism and Buddhism came from sort of the northern Indian region. So we'll be talking about these. What's interesting too about India is it really very much complicates the oral and written divide, because so much of their ancient works were repeated, chanted in mantras, just memorized over and over and over again. They very much complicate that divide between an oral culture and a written culture. It'll be really interesting distinctions to be drawn between the ancient texts of India and those of the West, of sort of like the Greeks, the Romans, the Hebrews over here, and then on the other end of things, China in the East. So, okay. These last slides, these are just sort of like interesting tidbits that kind of speak towards why this class exists. And so just kind of like things to keep in mind, like why are you taking this class? Why does liberal studies want you to do this? So one thing is that it's really interesting to think about this relatively short period of time, the 700 years between 1200 and 500 BC, because these three major systems of culture and writing kind of all cropped up at the same time. So all of the three primary documents of ancient China were perfected during this time period. The Hebrew, the Talmud, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and then also some of the more important books of Judaism were written during this time and kind of codified, reified, these sort of things. And then, of course, Homer and Hesiod, the kind of ancient classics of the Greek world, were also kind of perfected at this time. So this is kind of remarkable that in this short period of time, these three kind of like overarching, hugely important cultural touchstones came to be. Also keep in mind how religion is something that's going to really complicate the oral-written divide in terms of a culture. The two that really illustrate that are the origins of Hinduism, the Rig Veda, the Brahma, anyway, and then also the origins of Zoroastrianism, which we won't talk too much about, but that's something to kind of keep in mind. It's very hard to date these cultures because we weren't sure if they just had memorized everything or if they actually had written them down. You might have this question in your head. Does this cross-cultural contact influence the development of a language and culture? This is largely a question we won't be able to answer in our class. Like, we're not really archaeologists. Like, we won't be able to find facts that prove that cultures were in contact with one another. But to kind of give you some information on that, and that's what this slide is. In the Fertile Crescent region, we do know that there was very likely connections between Africa, Asia, and through ancient Egypt. It had this sort of like bridge effect. These through the sort of like Hebrew and the sort of languages of the Semitic people, they likely had connections to each other, and then within that, these groups probably connected as well. Of course, in the Chinese sort of region, there was a lot of cross-pollination in ancient China. The sort of Indo-European region also, there was definitely connections between the sort of west towards where the Greeks and the sort of ancient Greek Empire extended, and then in the east through sort of like the religious systems and everything. Here's just an image to kind of show how these regions probably were interacting with one another. The big one people are mostly interested in is like, was there connections between this region and then China? And that's, you know, some people argue vociferously yes, some people say we can't know. Sorry, I can't really answer that question for you, but we will kind of note some pretty interesting connections that potentially exist. But one thing to keep in mind, the sort of last plug for the class, is that if we think about the things that we will be covering in this class and why we're taking the class, we think about like sort of as the representative time for the ancient world of 1000 BC. We can think like of the sort of influence of this time period rippling out even today. And so here's kind of like some plugs for why this class is important. So yeah, of course, Chinese and the sort of languages that developed out of Chinese. Basically 1 billion people in the world speak these, and millions more are influenced by the written heritage of Chinese. So that's really important, you know, and that stems from this time period. By contrast, a very small percentage of the world speaks Hebrew or Greek today, but consider the influence of these languages through the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible was written in Greek, the Jewish Bible was written in Hebrew. If we think about those religious groups, that has affected basically 2 millennia of people. There's 1 billion Christians in the world. And then if you think about what that affected, of course, that influenced the rise of Islam as well. Judaism and Christianity are the origins of Islam. And so if we think about the Quran and the another 1 billion people that are influenced by that, we can think how important the development of these languages was. Also, the development of written languages stems from this time. Most of today's languages are alphabetic. They're either alphabetic or they're under the influence of Semitic languages. So both of those existed and were invented and perfected during this time. And then if we think about Vedic Sanskrit, this is the sort of the language system of ancient India, that became the source of Hinduism and then later Buddhism and Jainism, which further influences another 1 billion people. So like this is like billions of people that were influenced by all the stuff that happened in 1000 BC. So it continues to have this, the ancient world and ancient forms of knowledge and values continue to have a shape on our modern world. And so hopefully this class will be an opportunity to think about that in more detail. And it's also a great opportunity to read some of the most enduring stories that we have in the world. So I'm looking forward to the semester with you. And yeah, I'll see you soon. Bye. Oh, homework tips, I forgot. So here's my tips for homework. This is just a plugs for helping you get through the homework. So I will be posting introductions to Brightspace. Sometimes the introductions won't be necessary, so you won't need to read them or anything. But if they're posted, it's helpful to read them. They might help guide your reading. Then see what reading method works for you. I'm pretty open about this. You don't have to tell me which one you're doing. I don't care, whatever works best for you. You might read the assigned text first and then watch the lecture video that I make. That could work. That could be great. You might watch the video first to help guide your readings and then read through the ancient texts. Sometimes these ancient texts are really difficult to read. It's hard to find your footing. You can kind of experiment to see which one works best for you. I do very much encourage you to read everything. It's expected. I expect you to read everything that I assign. It will help you as well to spend some time reading through the text, because I won't be able to cover everything in the lecture videos. But yeah, as you read, here's my suggestions for taking notes about the readings so you can prepare for class. What strikes you as interesting? Maybe a word is repeated several times and you don't quite get why. You might circle it and be like, what's going on? Maybe there's an idea that gets referenced, like, oh, maybe that reminds you of something you talked about in another class or something like this, an idea that intrigues you, like, why is this here? Maybe there's a contradiction. Maybe the text contradicts itself. Maybe you read something in the text that contradicts something I said in a video. Great, bring that up, that's awesome. Maybe there's a question that surfaces for you and you don't quite know how to grapple with it. Great. So stuff that strikes you, something that gives you kind of pause. As you're reading, you can consider the text in and of itself. These texts that we're reading, like I said before, they were perfected over centuries. That means that they are very cohesive. They are very thought out. So thinking of the text in and of itself will be generative for you. Like, how is this text cohesive and whole? Where does it contradict itself? And what might those contradictions imply? You might also think of the text in relation to other texts. You won't be able to do that until we start reading more things, but you can compare Gilgamesh to another epic hero, Achilles or something. So that can sometimes be very useful as you're reading. And then this is sort of a plug for the theme of the course, consider form. What form does the object take and why? Like, if it's a piece of art, why does it look that way? If it's a textual form, why is it a poem, for example? Why is it a narrative, sort of thing? Why does it look the way that it does? You might ask yourself, what form does the story take? Why tell the story in this form? Like, like a third-person narrative versus first-person narrative or something. Why tell the story with this character as our central focus? Why not some other character? Why tell the story with this narrator? What would it mean if we narrated the story from his mother's point of view or something like that, or his girlfriend's or something, or a god's point of view? And then return to Brightspace to complete any mini assignments. Those will be the ways in which I kind of keep track of your engagement over the days of the semester, so please keep up with those. They shouldn't be very taxing. And then come to our synchronous class sessions prepared to discuss your ideas, your questions, your notes, so that we can get even more engagement, because yeah, other people think of things that you would never have thought of, so it's always great to talk together. So, but the more you prepare, the more generative those class sessions will be. So please definitely do your homework and spend some time with them. Okay, looking forward to meeting you in person.